Okay, good afternoon. Welcome along to this hearing for the parking control bylaw. Welcome to those joining us on the live stream. My name, for those of you that haven't been here before, is Darren Ludlow, and I'm the chair for this process. The other members of the hearings panel are Councillors Peter Kett and Alan Arnold, and our paper author Andrew Cameron has zoomed in. Are there any declarations of interest the panel members have? No, none from me either. Just to confirm the timetable, there is an adjustment in that we now have an apology from Tracy Peters, who was going to be our second presenter, so I think Melanie is coming forward. Sorry, I'm acutely aware that the sound system is not the best in here, so if you have trouble hearing me at any stage, just stick your hand up as a reminder to me to talk into the microphone. Councillors, we have a late submission which has come in from Lynette Olsen. I think it arrived this morning or yesterday. I have no problem with accepting it as late because it's not dissimilar to the comments that have been submitted anyway. Do you want to move it?
Move that we receive it.
Thanks, Peter. Alan? Put that all in favour? Carried. Just a reminder, so the process is, as with all our hearings, that the submitters have 10 minutes. If you want to use all that time, that's fine. If you want us to ask questions, finishing a little shy of that is sometimes useful. If you'd like to come up and take a seat, you're first up. Welcome along, and thank you for your submission. Sorry, as a matter of procedure, and I've just gone and backed out of it. One moment. So, councillors, I'll move first of all recommendations 1 to 5 before we get underway, which is we received the report from Mr. Cameron, received the submissions, which includes the late submission. We've agreed to accept, receives the feedbacks on the disabled taxi parks trial, and notes the submitters to be heard, and notes the summary of submissions. No decisions are being made at that point, so I'll move those. If this is seconded, Peter, thank you. Put that all in favour. Against? Carried. Great. Thank you for your submission. The next short period of time is yours.
Right, my name is Melvin Butler, and obviously disappointed in speaking with you guys today with regards to where we're heading down this road with the submission. I'd like to first of all thank the staff for agreeing with the submissions that in regards to the wording in the bylaw that was obviously worded wrong, and changing those words. It's a bit confusing for me though, because obviously this is purely regarding revenue gaining rather than the interest of the public in encouraging people to come to the CBD. I believe that it's the council's responsibility to encourage people to come into our city and support the local businesses, and not scare them away with a complicated parking system that is a bit hard to use and simply results in fines.
Quick note, Melvin, the decision makers are over here.
Oh yeah, that's fine. The other point that I'll bring to you as well is, you know, this is a public streets. It's not a parking building owned by Wilson's Car Parking. The suggestion of the 30-minute free parking to be removed at the last minute is outrageous and is unfair, and I'll let my solicitor talk to you about the rest.
Good afternoon, councillors. My name is Christy Rusher, and I'd just like the Governance Officer to scroll down to resolution, or proposed resolution 6F, because that is the topic I'll talk to first. Now, this is suggesting that section 6 of the bylaw is amended to remove 30 minutes of free parking. I just need to draw to the council's attention that that isn't an available option. It's firstly not available because section 6 doesn't prescribe 30 minutes of free parking, so there is no wording or language to amend. Unfortunately, it appears that someone hasn't reviewed the bylaw before coming up with that resolution. But the second reason is that this hasn't been consulted on. So your council has received legal advice from Wynne Williams about the appropriate method or process for passing a bylaw and changing a bylaw. And you haven't consulted on the concept or the issue of removing the initial 30 minutes free. There are no submissions seeking that 30 minutes free is removed, and therefore you've got no scope because you haven't consulted on it. It hasn't been included as a draft provision in the bylaw in the first place, and so that resolution in my submission is not available to council today and it should be removed as a proposed resolution. So the second point, or moving to the thrust of the submission that's been provided to council previously, that submission outlines there has been some difficulty with the process here. In preparing the documents to go out to public consultation, the council hasn't provided any information about the privacy implications of everybody using a public space being required to enter their licence plate in order to qualify for 30 minutes of free parking. Now, that's using or entering your licence plate is a common practice in modern car parking buildings, and of course it's a process that we use in our new shopping mall here in Invercargill, but that doesn't apply to a public road. You can't treat the public road, which has been funded by ratepayers, or in the same way that you can a public parking building. It's not a contract, you're not renting a space. What's happening with our fine system and why parking fines are included in our land transport legislation and not in something different in terms of legislation is because the concept is that everyone is free to use a road up until the point that they are inconsiderate. So way back in the dark, distant, deep bowels of a British council, it was considered appropriate to fine people or to make it a criminal offence for someone being inconsiderate and staying in a parking space for too long. And that was the beginning, or the genesis, of parking spaces being restricted by time, and then that being followed up by government passing a law that allows you to fine people for failing to follow that time restriction period. So that is all your enabling legislation in the Land Transport Act allows you to do. When you're going further and prescribing a condition of parking, which means that if you don't enter your plate, you instantly qualify for a $40 fine instead of a $12 one if you just happen to stay longer than the 30 minutes. That's not a fair process. It's not provided for in the enabling legislation, and therefore, in my submission, it is ultra vires. And that is the key point that I've made in the written submission that hasn't been responded to in the council report. And I would suggest that you haven't been given full advice on the content and form of the submissions. I understand from Mr. Andrew Campbell that no one has sought legal advice on the submissions or the content of submissions. I understand that no one has sought advice on the particular content or proposed changes in the wording of the bylaw. The only legal advice that's been sought is what process to follow, and yet council hasn't even followed that process by proposing that it removes 30 minutes of free parking, which isn't even in the scope of the proposal that went out for consultation.
Council, can I point out that we do not, have not and have never sought legal advice on every submission that we've had on anything?
Yes, and I do have a view on that, but I won't share that today. So,
thank you.
Basically, where we're left is requesting that you don't pass the bylaw in the current form. What it would mean is that your current bylaw stays in place. There's absolutely no consequence to you by not. The one that you've got in place is still in place up until the point that it's replaced. The key part of the Local Government Act is that changing or making an amendment or passing a bylaw has to be necessary in the first place. Well, it's never been necessary for someone to disclose their private information through a licence plate entry. When we had the normal meter heads, or the old meter heads that the current kiosks replaced, it was a simple process of chalking tyres as the parking officer walked around the streets. That system has worked always, and it still will work. There's no reason for a bylaw to prescribe a licence plate to go into a parking kiosk in order to achieve the correct regulation of the parking system, which again, I repeat, is not, you're not running the streets like a parking building. You're not allowed to. You can't. And having a bylaw that requires that is not lawful because you don't have the enabling legislation to permit you to put those conditions in. So, Melvin, is there anything further that you wanted to conclude with?
Removing the 30 minutes.
Yep, so we covered that at the beginning. What else would you like to say? No? Nothing? Okay. So look, I think that's probably the key points, and I think that council is in difficulty if it passes the bylaw in its proposed form. The next steps that can happen will be the Minister can be requested to disallow the bylaw, the Minister of Transport. It could also go to the Ombudsman, it can go to the Court under Judicial Review. The critical thing is that this has gained so much media attention, you're under the spotlight to get this right and to get it correct. So what we really are asking is for you just to do nothing, keep your current bylaw in place and monitor the normal way for the 30 minutes of free parking by chalking tyres. There's an electronic chalking process in the meter or the parking officer's device. You don't even need to use physical chalk or carry it. They have a part of their program in which that can be managed appropriately. And they're walking the streets anyway. There is no reason, it is not necessary to have a bylaw requiring the entry of a registration plate in order to qualify for free parking, or any parking actually in Invercargill. So I'll close on that note.
Thank you.
Respond to any questions you may have.
Great, because I've got a few. Can I just clarify, and firstly, I'm perfectly aware of the review process. It's part of every process that we go through here, so I'm not lightly intimidated by that. Are you in support or not? I am confused of whether there should be 30 minutes free parking.
Everybody wants 30 minutes of free parking.
Okay.
Yep.
So can I ask you how that 30 minutes should be measured?
Yes, so that's what parking officers do with chalking of tyre. So that's the way that it's always been done.
So a
in New
parking
Zealand.
officer has to go around every park in Invercargill and chalk every tyre and register it. Do you see that as practical?
I do, because it's actually worked successfully for over 50 years. And I don't see why it needs to change, particularly when
But
they've
that
got
was
a
with,
device.
with a specific parking space where a metre was showing as expired. So there's a big difference between something showing as expired.
Oh, so I happen to know what happened in those situations. So
Me too.
It couldn't be an expired meter wasn't an example of someone not paying. They had to actually chalk it as expired at the time that they noticed it was expired, and then wait a further period of time and then come back and tick it. And the reason for that was that the meter may well have been faulty because it showed expired whether or not if it had been paid, unpaid, or if it was faulty. And to differentiate between the two, the parking officers always have had to chalk a tyre and then do a circuit and come back.
Sorry, it doesn't show as any different because it's still expired. A faulty meter was always able to be notified if somebody was ticketed. You were able to contact council and say that the meter was, that had been fed and was faulty.
Yep.
So can I just check that in your submission you're saying that it's not a legal act for us to be able to charge for people to park on the street?
No, it certainly is lawful when you do that in the prescribed way under the Land Transport Act. But it is not lawful for you to run the streets as a parking revenue gathering system or as a parking building. In the same
Is
way
there a
as
difference
parking
between revenue gathering and cost meeting?
Yes, and this is a criminal or a fine-based system in our regulatory framework. It is nothing to do with collecting or renting or paying for a space. It is simply showing that there is a criminal consequence or a fine consequence if you don't follow the prescribed conditions for parking. And so there is a benefit to council in that it gets to keep that revenue. It doesn't go to the Crown like it does in other offences. But we can't engineer bad behaviour or non-compliance. That's not a lawful process.
For the issue of privacy, I'm thinking of other public spaces where people's licence plates are simply red on the way in, and we've got at least 2 examples of that in Invercargill and Invercargill Central, and also Invercargill Airport.
Yes.
Are you telling me that's a breach of privacy?
I don't know is the answer, but those places are managed as public, not public spaces, they are private parking places, and they're not roads as defined under the Land Transport Act. They have their own.
Because a
legislation.
licence plate is only linked to the vehicle.
Correct.
So, for example, it might be owned by a business, it might be leased, so there's no person who's receiving information that is beyond theirs, and surely it's no different to the traffic surveillance systems that operate in major metropolitan cities in New Zealand.
Well, I think the traffic surveillance systems are not something I'm aware of, but I understand they're operated under a different branch of legislation, and certainly having surveillance of parking behaviour isn't something that's reasonable or necessary in terms of the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. And it's not even a necessary requirement for the council to effectively administer public parking spaces.
Nor are we seeking to surveil people's parking habits. We're just looking to see when someone has started to engage with using the parking space to calculate the 30 minutes. I'm sorry, I can't see the difference between that system and the impracticality of having somebody go around at will around several hundred parking spaces, chalking tyres to mark the time from then. So is there any other suggestion, or is that the only one that you've got?
So the roads are run under different legislation to the land that is used for parking at the parking building and at the airport. Neither of those are defined as legal roads under the Land Transport Act, and there is a specific provision for councils to charge on private land or to lease private land and make it available for parking. That is a rental or a leasing arrangement. Using a public road is a right, and that you have the freedom of the use of the highways, and so that's why when you have a different branch of legislation that prescribes that you're entitled to put in a restriction for time, and you're entitled to impose a fine for someone failing to meet that time restriction. You're not entitled to require someone to enter their plate and then fine them for not doing that when it's a free service. And why should the fine be higher for using a free service than one that's you've paid for? And
So I'm just coming,
unfortunately, you can't
I
change
understand
that.
these are all points that you've made in your submission. I'm still trying to clarify my mind. Your suggestion of the fact that we can't charge for people to park on a public road, which makes every city in New Zealand wrong.
No, you can charge. What I'm saying is you can't require someone to enter a plate to use a free service in order to qualify for it. So you certainly can charge, you can certainly time restrict, you can change or you can restrict what types of vehicles use a car parking space under the land transport legislation. But that is an entirely different legal framework to what applies at the parking building in the new mall. And
So
at the
it's
airport.
just the free 30 minutes that makes it illegal. Is that your submission?
No, it's not, but that is the proposal that is before you today, and so that is where the submission has been directed to. And you're the only council that requires, I did a survey of the parking bylaws in the major metros. Christchurch City Council doesn't require the entry of a plate. Auckland City Council doesn't require the entry of a plate. Their bylaws simply say if there is a requirement to pay, you must pay, and you get ticketed for not paying. It's a very simple system. They also use the pay by plate kiosk or a similar competing product, but they are not requiring it. And with the spotlight on this council over its parking issues, I'm simply submitting to you that you will be an anomaly in the entire country if you impose a restriction or a condition that requires you to enter your plate to use a free public service, which has been paid for by ratepayers already. And that's the difference between a public road and a private car parking building, and why the legislation is drafted differently.
Can I extrapolate that for a moment then? So if somebody wants to go to Splash Palace for a swim, are you telling them they should get in for free?
No, not at all.
So what's the difference?
I think I've made it clear that there are some...
Sorry, but you haven't, not in my mind.
Sure. So I'll try and assist you a bit further. So a public road has its own legal status and its own legislation. Private land on which is administered by the council is not a road, and therefore it has different legal requirements that apply to it.
And there are differences between city roads and state highways as well, and our legislation has always been
Yes, it's always
adapted
divided.
to reference the appropriate act to ensure that that's complied with, because Waka Kotahi are in charge of the state highways.
Yes. So the council has two roles. One is administering land it has a title, and the other role is administering roads and the use of roads. They have different parts of legislation, and you're entitled to do different things. I'm saying don't mix the two of them together. Keep the road system as it has always been, and just simply chalk tyres. You don't need to pass this bylaw.
Thank you, Council. Councillors, I'm aware I've gone long. Any questions from Councillor Arnold? Can you pull your microphone up?
Yeah, my thoughts are exactly the same as yours. I mean,
I'm not thinking, I'm just asking questions. It's just
we
questions
can
at this
obviously
stage.
See, why you can obviously see why the never pay thing was suggested by council. You know, because how can you otherwise know when the 30-minute starts? You know, you'd have to have a lot of people going around town, I guess. So my thoughts are, I guess.
We're not after your thoughts at the moment, Councillor. It's just questions.
No, well, yeah, I'm just probably my questions were pretty much what yours were.
Cool, thank you. Peter? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Council. Appreciate the time and that you've also travelled down to Invercargill today to be in front of us. So that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Melanie? Thank you for that. Melanie, welcome along.
Hello, my name's Melanie and I am here to talk to Council about the proposed disabled taxi park trial. Now, my point that I'm going to make is that I don't believe that this is addressing the true problem, which is not enough disabled parks for the 2,340 plus badge holders that you have in Invercargill City alone. So I think there needs to be more disabled parks and not just taxi stops. So what actually is disabled? Now the location that you've chosen for the taxi drop-offs, I believe, is portraying the wrong social assumptions. It looks like, whether you mean it or not, it looks like you're suggesting that disabled people are a society burden. The needle exchange, Wins and the pub are three of them. We already have enough trouble with society assumptions. So do you believe that everybody that's disabled is in a wheelchair? Well, not necessarily. Do you believe everybody that's disabled can't walk? Also, not necessarily. So if I was to get up and walk around out of my chair, does that make me a fraud? Am I now not allowed to use a disabled space? No, that's not the case. And this is all the issues that I come upon all the time whilst using the 10 or so spaces that council has in the city centre already. I had a confrontation on Esk Street whilst parked in one of those two 30-minute parks on Esk Street opposite Westpac. I was sitting in the car, I'd put the badge in the window and I hadn't yet gotten out, and a woman drove up beside me and started shouting at me about how I didn't have a right to park there. Do I look disabled from here up? No. Does that make me not disabled? No. I had to get out and wave my leg at her for her to realise that it was actually just. And this is the kind of assumption that I'm fearing the council are making too for disabled people and the access that they need. Why taxi drop-offs and why not more parking spaces? Did council know that there's very limited taxis available for wheelchair taxis in the city? Two the last time I knew, and one of those lived in Bluff. I have actually had to cancel or reschedule flights on more than one occasion because I cannot get me and my wheelchair to the airport before 9. But that's a separate issue entirely. Did Council know that, according to BJ Clark, the National Manager for Access and Infrastructure, who works for CCCS, who issue the parking badges, he told me there are 2,340 badge holders in the city centre alone. That's not including the outlying areas and other places. So the badge criteria gives mixed messages, that's a separate issue. But did Council know that you only have to be able to have a restriction on your walking distance to hold a badge for a mobility park, which is used with the sign disabled park? So therefore, suddenly, there's a whole bunch of other people that need these parking spaces that perhaps haven't initially come to your mind. I also asked BJ Clark about the national law for the percentage of disabled parking spaces over normal parking spaces, and he said that law had recently been devolved to councils. I wasn't actually able to find that law for Invercargill City Council, so I wondered if somebody could perhaps point me towards it. But I'll finish off with this. Are your 10 parking spaces in the city centre blocks alone, are they enough? Will taxi drop-offs really help? And who do you think they're helping? Thanks.
Thank you. And I understand the assumptions that people make around disability, because there are, as you point out, quite a variety of them. And both on our streets and in private car parks where disability parking spaces are made available. I think we've all seen examples of some people going a bit feral.
Rage.
Yeah. And sorry that you have to go through that. Look, you make some really good points. One of the other pieces of feedback that we've had is that for mobility vehicles with a rear drop ramp, that some of the spaces aren't necessarily big enough, and the ramp occasionally lowers into the flow of traffic.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can't park on end-to-end parking spaces on the side of this road because I can't get the wheelchair out of the boot then. Some parking spaces are too narrow, and I have to be able to open the door wide to actually be able to get in and out with only having one leg, and I can't always. And then the way they're painted is also, there's also an anomaly, because a lot of people don't know, neither did I until I had to use one, that disabled parking spaces can be painted extra wide or a normal size with a yellow box. I've also had parking rage there too, with somebody thinking that the yellow box is actually a walkway. So there's also that issue, that like if you're going to be looking at the width of parking spaces, perhaps that could also be standardised.
So is your submission then, first of all, that there aren't enough disability access parking spaces, but where do you stand on, and no pun intended, I apologise, on the issue of do we conduct a trial on some additional taxi parking sites?
Like I said at the beginning, I think that council's money is probably being put in the wrong place by considering for disabled taxi drop-offs, because you've got a limited amount of disabled wheelchair accessible taxis in the city that only work at certain times, and the bigger problem is actually the number of badge holders you've got and the amount of disabled parking spaces that you've got. I think the money could be better spent there.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Kett, any questions? Councillor Arnold?
No.
No. Look, Melanie, thank you very much for not only making a submission, but for also making the effort to come and present to us this afternoon. We appreciate that and take those comments on board.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Councillors, at this point I'm going to move to adjourn the hearing and call on Councillor Campbell to come up and start the Extraordinary Infrastructure and Projects Committee, and then he'll adjourn that and then we'll carry on. We'll reconvene and carry on. So I'm adjourning the hearing. For those on the live